sanding them off, I'm scuffing them up so that when I do solder the leads to that adapter plug, the solder makes a great connection. It's strong, a good bond, which won't break. Let me just zoom in here so you can see what I'm doing. Notice that's a size N adapter plug. That's a pretty popular brand, a pretty popular size. Most gateways, Toshibas use a size N. And I'm just scuffing the metal of those leads. So when I drop some solder on there, it'll stick really well. Now I'm going to pull the soldering iron out. This is the soldering iron I use. As you can tell, I like Radio Shack. They're not the cheapest, but they always have what I want. And I'm just using a piece of Scotch-Brite there to get the remaining solder off of the soldering iron. If you see it in the soldering iron holder there. And basically what we're going to do is attach those two wires to those two leads on the adapter plug. I'm going to expose some wire on the white lead there. Now again, you have to sand these wires, both the ground wire and the positive wire. You need to sand them because the little wires in these power adapters are coated. And solder doesn't like to stick to that when they're coated. There's little strands in there that are coated. And you'll notice once you sand these wires on these power adapters, if you're doing a repair like I'm doing, you're going to start to expose copper on the wires. When you start to see copper on those wires, then you know you're getting that coating off and the solder will stick very readily to the copper. So it's going to be tough to get solder to stick to these wires unless you do what I'm doing now. Sand the strands of wire inside the power adapter lines there until you see copper. And once you start to see the copper, you'll know that your solder is going to stick and make a good bond and not break off. Okay, now that that's done and we have some copper exposed, we know that our solder is going to stick. Just make sure you get enough of that copper exposed that you're confident your solder job is going to be okay. Okay, now here's what I'm talking about. Those are the strands of wire that I was sanding, and you'll see a tinge of copper now on those ends of those wires because I sanded it. Now we know our solder will stick. If we didn't do this, you'd have a tough time getting solder to stick to those wires. Trust me. You might be asking now, why don't they just buy a new power adapter? Well, you could do that too, but if you want to learn how to do this, I'm showing you. I'm going to grab a little device called Helping Hands. It allows me to place objects in there. It's just a pole with two alligator clips on it. It allows me to place an object in there, and it actually acts as an extra set of hands, which I do not have. And I'm going to just put that adapter plug in there. Going to zoom in and help you get a good view here. Going to add some solder and just tin the edges of those adapters there, or those leads there. Just put some solder on each one of those leads. I like to melt it on there so it's all melted on there. You can see how the solder's on there. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the leads for this power adapter. Now please note, this power adapter is unplugged at this point. Do not work while it's plugged in. I only plugged it in to test the voltage, and then I unplugged it. Okay, we're going to take a big piece of heat shrink tubing. I'm going to cut a little size of it off. And I'm going to put that around our wire. Now that's a real big piece, real wide, but we're going to need at least one wide piece to get around the adapter plug. Then I'm going to use a thinner piece just to shield the connectors. Again, this is somewhat of an unorthodox way of doing a repair on these power adapters, but it makes a sturdy bond, and I've done it a few times in the past with no problem. So make sure you get your heat shrink tubing through your wire before you do any soldering to the actual adapter plug. Otherwise, it would be too late. Okay, so let's get some solder on the end of those leads there. Also, again, this is the way I like to solder. I like to tin things with the solder before I actually solder them. And I'm just globbing some solder onto the end of that lead there. And I'm doing the same thing right on just on the end for the ground wire. Now, the adapter plug and these leads both have solder on them. Now, what I like to do now is just stick them together, heat them up, and let the solder melt into each other. I need to make sure that which wire is which on the adapter plug, which one is ground and which one is positive. So I'm using my voltmeter to test that. I'm just holding a lead to the outside of the tip and then testing which lead is positive and negative. And once I know that, I'm going to be able to solder that ground tip to the ground wire. Just want to test it there. See, I'm touching the ground wire to the outside of the tip, and I'm touching the positive the inside of the tip. I've heard a beep on both of those. You can't hear it because the clip is muted, but we heard the beep on both of those, so we know that the connection was proper. Or at least we heard the beep on the ground one. We didn't solder the positive one yet. The ground wire is the unshielded one. Now we're soldering the positive.